You seem to have caught me perusing through this book of American history. Oh, here's something interesting. It's about the abolition movement in the 19th century. Let's start from the beginning. Chapter 1, The Change in the South. Well, by the 19th century, slavery had become a truly Southern institution. Its primary crops had changed tremendously over the 19th century. In 1800, cotton was only 7.1% of the total Southern exports. But by 1860, it was 57.5% of total Southern exports. So what made cotton king? Well, first, Southern soils had been depleted by tobacco farming, which had taken place during much of the 18th century, and other cash crops like rice were confined to the coast where soils were much more fertile. But why choose cotton? Well, first, there was a huge demand for cotton in Europe. British textile factories ran through cotton very quickly. Second, the large amounts of Indian removal that had occurred led to new lands being able to be cultivated. And third, there were new industrial technologies like the cotton gin and the reaper, which greatly eased production of cotton. Why did it work so well, though? Well, first off, the South has a very warm climate, wet weather, and has some dry seasons interspersed, such as fall. And cotton was very cheap to harvest. It was contrast this with sugar and tobacco, which required huge capital investments for machinery, irrigation, and other farming implements. So cotton could be profitable from small to very large scales. But what specifically did cotton need? First, there needed to be a lot of cheap labor to pick it. Therefore, the rise of cotton coincided with the rise of slavery. And cotton also led to the rise of a new type of agriculture called plantation agriculture. Its characteristics include highly divided labor with domestic slaves, field hands, and that usually led to immense profits. So, cotton caused a large change in slavery. In the 18th century, slaves were usually male. They were taken by force from many different African cultures. But by the mid-19th century, there were equal amounts of female and male slaves. Most of them were born in America. Most of them spoke English. They were all truly native-born and truly American slaves. So the sentiments towards slavery changed quite a bit during the 19th century. In the early 19th century, most of the abolitionists were black, and they disagreed with white abolitionists who wished for colonization, which was sending free slaves back to African countries like Liberia. But as more and more large-scale plantations went up, the slaveless whites, or yeoman farmers, became disillusioned with the plantation system. These slaveless whites made up 75% of Southerners in 1860. They held a belief that competition from slave labor was costing jobs for the poor whites. This was encapsulated in a document called The Impending Crisis of the South, which argued that it is in non-slavers' interest to abolish slavery. In response, the wealthy began to spread many racial attacks on slaves that divided the poor whites from the blacks. So, taken as a whole, abolition sentiment both from blacks and from whites increased from 1800 to 1850. This also created a rather deep split in the South, between the Upper South and the Lower South. The Upper South was characterized by a lower reliance on slaves. There were many more yeoman farmers and small slaveholders. The culture in the Upper South tended to identify with those slaveless farmers. There was also a lower reliance on cotton, and as a result, there was not as strong pro-slavery as the Deep South. In the Deep South, there was a much greater reliance on slaves. There were planters with huge numbers of slaves and large tracts of land. And there were also small slave owners. But there was a very large reliance in the Deep South of cotton as a cash crop, and as a result was very strongly pro-slavery.
Chapter 2. Whites' take on the slavery movement. Let me just acquire my notes. The whites were split between pro-slavery and abolitionists. The abolitionists themselves, who were anti-slavery, were divided into two main groups. One main group was for immediate emancipation. This group was spearheaded by William Henry Lloyd Garrison. Was not giving any room for slavery. He wanted it immediately abolished. That's called immediate emancipation. But one of his quotes about this is, "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." To promote immediate emancipation, William Henry Lloyd Garrison first had to convince the people that slavery was sinful and its existence was intolerable. He also said that blacks should have same legal rights as whites. This was a huge deal back then because even the vast majority of anti-slavery whites did not believe in civil rights for blacks. William Henry Lloyd Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 to promote his beliefs. By the 1840s, there were over 1,500 local societies. The society worked to spread anti-slavery propaganda, and it flooded Congress with petitions calling for an end to slavery in the District of Columbia. However, in 1836, Congress passed the gag rule, which limited the discussion of the anti-slavery movement in Congress itself. The other group of white abolitionists, not the immediate emancipation group, was the group for gradual emancipation, and this group was spearheaded by Theodore Well. Now, both groups used public speeches and propaganda. They both had religious influences, and they used morals. They went along with the other reform movements of the time, including the women's rights movement and such. Although the vast majority, however, of the people that believed in emancipation did not believe, as I've said, in equal rights for blacks. The white abolitionists combined their movements into several areas. First off, education of the public, through newspapers and magazines key, such as William Henry Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator and Godey's Ladies' Book. New colleges also sprang up as a result of religious influence and local pride. Poorly funded, but the colleges unfortunately were poorly funded and they died out. The Liberty Party, founded in 1840, was the first national anti-slavery party. The first presidential candidate campaigned on the platform of free soil, a non-expansion of slavery into new western territories, meaning despite the Missouri Compromise, that all new territories that became states would not be allowed to have slaves. Another movement, the sources are disputed over its actual impact, was the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was supposedly a group of whites creating safe havens for slaves on their journey north from the runaway slaves on their journey north. Some say that this had a great impact, but other sources say that despite the Underground Railroad, the vast majority of runaway slaves actually stayed in the South, so its impact was negligible. Another very important society created by the white abolitionists was the American Colonization Society in 1816. That was the group that advocated the gradual emancipation, and when they emancipated slaves, they would compensate the slave owner for the slave's value. And they also promoted the shipment of freed blacks to Africa, to the country of Liberia. The other white take on slavery was the pro-slavery group. For a long time, people had justified slavery as a necessary evil, meaning that although it was immoral and it was bad to have to enslave other people, it was necessary for the Southern economy and thus America as a whole. But towards the 1830s and the 1860s, a new pro-slavery argument arose, and this one focused on slavery as a positive good. The historical defense for this argument was that Athens and other historical societies were slave societies, but Athens, despite being a slave society, was able to produce such great people as Plato and Aristotle. Furthermore, Rome, which is the basis for all Western civilization and thus a major impact on America, was a slave society. George Fitzhugh was an important figure in the pro-slavery movement. He compared slaves to northern factory workers, arguing that wage slaves in the North, which were the whites that worked in horrible factory conditions, were much worse off than slaves in the South whose owners actually cared for their conditions in a conscientious manner. The pro-slavery argument was not necessarily aimed at convincing Northerners to join the Southern cause, but was more in reinforcing the yeomen and non-slaveholders' beliefs in the pro-slavery argument.